Hi, I'm Shazad Wadalwala. I'm the VP of Strategy here at Verse, and I've been in energy for over 20 years, starting my career at Pacific Gas and Electric, the big investor-owned utility in Northern California. And then just before Verse, I was at Google as an energy portfolio manager. And I do have a confession to make. In all my years, this is my first time playing fantasy football, and I did not realize just how much fantasy football and energy markets had in common. I'll save some more thoughts on that for later, but just for all of you out there, just there might be some references to football this during this presentation. Sam, I'll hand off to you.
Thanks, Shazad. I'm Sam Cotterall. I lost all three of my fantasy football matchups this week one, and have been playing for a decade plus. So I think that is a good foundational, first year versus veteran doesn't matter. There's volatility across the board, but we'll get into that. My name's Sam Cotterall, Director of Client Enablement at Verse. I joined Verse this year after 4 years with the Schneider Electric Renewable Energy and Carbon Advisory team. And prior to that, spent 7 years with the Bloomberg organization, first in DC, focused on energy and transportation policy, and then later up in New York with the New Energy Finance Group. So excited to be with you all today.
All right, so in terms of agenda, we just did our welcome and intros. We're going to do a deep dive into the state of the market, what's keeping energy and sustainability leaders up at night, some tactics, a little bit about who we are, and then a case study and some Q&A. So a lot to cover. We'll try to keep it moving quick, but we do want you to ask questions throughout. So we'll probably focus more on answering clarification questions during the presentation, and the more meaty stuff will probably be left to the Q&A. So with that, let's get into the state of the market. So first, let's talk about what are the big changes from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Number one, and on the bottom left, you'll see there's an accelerated credit expiration for wind and solar. Basically, everything needs to begin construction by July 4th, 2026, which was 1 year after the bill was signed. And then there were two parts and placed in service by December 31, 2027 to get the full tax credit. That's for solar and wind. For other technologies, they were not harmed as much. I would say and we have on that chart there, storage, geothermal, hydro, nuclear. The tax credits remain through 2033 and then start to phase down. So this bill really affected wind and solar more than anything else. And the other part to this is the begin construction. There was an executive order that came out in August that also made it harder to get the begin construction label. And so that stricter guidance requires, there were traditionally two tests. There was a physical test and a financial commitment test, where the financial was 5% of total cost. Now, that option was removed for larger utility scale projects, and limited only to the physical work test. I see, is that an and or for and start? It's an and. So begin construction must occur before July 4th, 2026, and placed in service by December 31st, 2027. And then the other thing to highlight, so there's one is the physical work test. Second is the new foreign entity of concern restrictions. So the foreign entity of concern restrictions can sound quite scary. Essentially, it's to ensure that the energy infrastructure that's being placed in the United States is not unduly influenced by foreign entities, particularly in China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. And so while we're not going to go into all of that, we'll just highlight that this is something that can cause consternation in terms of the regulatory uncertainty of which supply chain partners, which developers are going to be impacted by this, and in particular, what are the compliance hurdles in order to demonstrate that any project that's being built does not trigger this restriction.
Yeah, I think it's just
yeah.
important to note that this isn't the first time that this industry has seen phasing out of tax credits. Rather than being written into the tax code, this is something that is re-legislated regularly, and it hasn't really hit the brakes for the industry. In fact, at least in the short term. The midterm and the long term are a whole nother conversation, but developers and corporates are acting quickly. There's a sense of urgency. We are rushing to lock in projects that still qualify for tax incentives before these deadlines that Shazad was talking about kick in. What does that mean, though? It leaves us with a classic, as an econ major, but a classic supply and demand question. What happens when you have more buyers chasing a finite pool of eligible projects? We've seen those impacts already, and you can see in this headline, or maybe you can't see under the headline, but this article points out a 4% increase in PPA prices since the passage of the bill. So what does that mean? So power prices, and this means that a lot of that power pricing is shifting to developers, and some of you are going to be like, Sam, shifting. It's already been in the hands of developers for the last few years. Yeah, it's shifting even further into the hands of developers. But what does that mean for procurement leaders? I think the takeaway is pretty clear. The waiting may mean paying more or completely missing out, at least for tax credit eligible, full tax credit eligible projects. So the window is open. There's a rush of activity, a flurry of activity, but it is narrowing much more quickly than what we had expected before July 4th.
Next. All right, so now this might look a little contradictory to the flurry of commercial activity, but one thing to highlight that just even as the president, as Donald Trump became president, there was already a lot of regulatory uncertainty about what was going to happen to clean energy incentives. So even from the beginning of this year, we started to see a slowing investment in the U.S. renewable sector, shifting to other parts of the world, especially Europe. So if you look on that chart on the bottom right, there's like a peak in early 2024 and then a gradual decline. So we did already start to see that the investment in new projects in the renewable sector was starting to pull towards Europe. So what does that mean? That means going back to the supply demand that Sam mentioned on number 2, now you've had a pullback of investment in projects, and then now we've got clarity that you got to move fast. So it's kind of a perfect storm for needing to go to market and making sure you know what you're going into and being able to move quickly.
Okay, so we're expecting in that medium to long-term potential impact on capacity addition, specifically from renewable energy, which, as many of you likely know, the fastest construction to generating power cycle is a solar PV plant, followed by onshore wind. And after that, you're looking at different types of gas. So what we're seeing here is just an unclear in that medium to long term what the renewable energy picture will look like. But given the need for electrons, so what you're seeing in that middle chart is over the last about 20 years, it's been a pretty flat demand story in not just the United States, but the developed world, where new demand hasn't been coming on, and optimizing the existing supply around a flat demand was really the planning. That's all changed, and everyone's seen this story. But this is industrial electrification of transportation, and of course data centers and AI, the buzzword of the last couple of years. So something really important to point out here is a lot of thought has gone into, or a lot of questions around, okay, can the other technologies meet this demand? And what we're seeing in the natural gas build out forecast is kind of business as usual, and a lot of this has to do with long lead time on gas turbines. So in that kind of out to 2030 timeline, we're seeing around 9 gigawatts a year of capacity addition from gas, but that's about what it's been for the last 2 decades. So the real question is, where is this additional supply going to come from?
Yeah, and I'll add also, like, this is the projection of the build out, but one other thing that we're seeing happening is there's a lot of plants that were supposed to retire that are not going to retire because with that energy demand growing in that middle chart, we're seeing like the MISO market giving emergency orders to retain plants for reliability reasons, and we're seeing capacity markets, PJM and Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, and then the Mid-Continent ISO. They're seeing higher capacity prices than ever, which is sending strong signals to retain all the current resources that were probably on the verge of retiring where markets were just a few years ago. So there's that story is also playing out. So yeah, I would just highlight that we're seeing a lot of plants that were expected to retire remain online and get recontracted.
And most of those planned retirements are old coal plants, old natural gas, relatively inefficient compared to new natural gas turbines. So for those of you with an S in your title on this call, yes, that means that the natural decarbonization of the grid or is not necessarily going to happen the way that it was forecast to happen not too long ago. So I guess one of the takeaways here is we're not thinking about renewables in isolation. The grid you're buying from is evolving fast, and the strategies around risk and cost are really going to need to take into account this diverse generation mix. So not just wind and storage. And I'm wondering, Shazad, we have one picture here that we haven't touched on. What are your thoughts around utility scale storage? You mentioned it from a tax credit incentive on one of your first slides. What does that mean in this context?
Yeah, so utility scale storage is one area that's not slowing down. We're seeing all projections that it's going to continue to grow. ERCOT has had massive built out of storage. And even as we see demand growth, the leading market for demand growth is in ERCOT in Texas. And we're going to continue to see a lot of build out of storage, of renewables. One thing to highlight, and Sam mentioned the long lead time for those other resources, even without the incentives, in terms of getting capacity online, solar and storage continue to be the fastest way to get somewhat like firm, reliable energy to meet all this growing demand. So we expect to see storage to keep growing and be a big area of interest. And quite frankly, a lot of corporates haven't looked at storage. It's been more of like a niche thing, and we're starting to hear more people talk about like, where does storage fit into my portfolio? And so just highlighting with it being a beneficiary of these tax credits, and there's more and more opportunity for storage going forward.
So that wraps up our state of the market. Where are we? Where are we going? I think, in speaking with our clients and just talking to the industry as a whole, there are pieces of this that are keeping leaders up at night. So we're excited to dive into some of these and hopefully at the end recommend some tactics and ways of thinking about these problems to help navigate.
So quickly, Sam, before we move into that, I saw that there were a couple questions. Just want to acknowledge. So one was around like what's the likelihood of meeting the timelines um, in terms of getting start of construction by July and then meeting the COD. Given the lead time for projects and interconnection, you pretty much have to be pretty late stage already to feel confident that you're going to get there by December of 2027, in particular to get the financing that's needed. So a lot of these projects, many leaders are saying, I need to sign something within the next 3 to 9 months, really. And in order to make sure that the project is comfortable with my signing it and that they can meet all the requirements in terms of like getting that tax credit. Alternatively, if there's risk of that or delays, one of the things that's likely to happen is change of law risk or risk sharing around earning those tax credits. So just highlighting for projects that don't feel confident or their financiers aren't concerned about meeting those timelines, there will likely be provisions to share some of that tax credit risk. So that was one question. There was another one about, is storage renewable? Yes, it depends on the definition. Like, of course, storage is only renewable if it's charged with renewables. And so there's a lot of incentive to co-locate storage, but also recognizing that like duck curve effects are happening. There's a lot more solar on the grid in ERCOT, to the extent, and CAISO continues to be a place where there's a lot of solar in the middle of the day. To the extent that the solar is being built out and the storage is moving it to non-solar hours, I think there's continues to be a strong story that it's part of the renewable integration story.
Certainly enabling for higher penetration renewables, definitely, but not standalone necessarily. All right, so what's keeping people up at night? Well, I've set a target. I was on track to meeting it. The rules of the game have changed. This is your commissioner in fantasy football, potentially changing the scoring or in our case in this league, the injured reserve policy that we're playing with. So, what do we do here? You see an announcement here from an alliance that have kind of have changed or ditched their pledges. I think one of the big points I want to make here is, investors punish the opacity or the lack of transparency more than misses. So like credibly rebaselining and thinking about like a scenario tested procurement roadmap and being transparent about these interim metrics. If we're shifting our mindset from an annual match to an hourly match, like what does that mean for my renewable percentage? And sharing those numbers rather than kind of hiding in the background and is something that we think preserves confidence and is important and better than a vague deferral. So yes, the goalposts have moved. You're perfectly you're in a position where you potentially might need to change your pledges as well. Our recommendation is to be transparent. So, bring your finance and your audit team into your plan so that these targets are like budgeted commitments rather than just aspirational slides. And, if there is stakeholder visibility, whether it's through your CSR or an earnings call or however you are, sharing your progress in decarbonization, just be transparent around how these changes are impacting you and what that might mean from a timing or a commitment perspective.
All right, so greenhouse gas protocol. I, I'm not even sure how many ENS leaders are able to stay up at night because they might not even know that this is happening. This is what I'd call the under the radar sleeper pick in terms of what could change the whole game, and how things play out in the league. Basically, right now, the greenhouse gas protocol is going through its first real revision in about a decade. And the impetus for this is renewable energy. I think more and more people are realizing it's not just about getting megawatt hours onto the grid, but it's getting it into the right times and places. And so there's essentially two schools of thought here on how to think about that. But mainly it's like different time of day matters and the intensity of the grid that you're in matters. And so from that perspective, there's a lot of revisions that are going to look at revisiting market boundaries and the measurement of the impact that a particular project has from a environmental standpoint. And so right now, where we are, we're right in the middle of it, where the technical working group you see there in September is talking to or is getting feedback from the Independent Standards Board, and then is going to go out for public consultation um, in the back half of this year. And when is this? This is all supposed to complete in the next 1 to 2 years and will affect as soon as 2027 or 2028 scope 2 reporting. And so a lot of the activities that ENS leaders are considering right now as they're trying to meet 2030 goals are going to come into the purview of whatever goes on with the greenhouse gas protocol. So just flagging if that this is a very significant thing that could change how you think about your net zero plans, especially for 2030, or, as Sam mentioned, maybe there's an honest rollback of a commitment. We aren't going to be able to meet this 2030. The market's too crazy for us right now. We'll do it 2035, but all of a sudden your goalposts are changing not only from how the market's evolving, but also the way you're measured and evaluated.
So speaking of strategies, I think something that we can all say with confidence in this volatile world that we're living in is that timing the market is almost impossible. So what you're seeing here are a year's worth of expectations in the futures market for what the around the clock power cost in ERCOT for August of this year was going to be. Um, Crazy swings going all the way up to over $150 a megawatt hour, nearly double the expectations from a time period before that, and then falling almost 70%, was I say 67% within a single year. So for an energy buyer, that level of uncertainty makes it extremely difficult to budget, plan, explain risk to a CFO who may not be living and breathing these markets every day. And what actually happened is the around the clock. Now that August has closed, and we know the actual pricing, the around the clock average was around $38. So what does that mean? Like I said at the top, timing the market is next to impossible. So what do you do? This is where a corporate with a structured procurement strategy and risk frameworks excels. So, it's less about picking the perfect entry point, and it's more about having these guardrails around your plans, whether it's in diversification or robust analytics. Essentially, just trying to make sure that these swings, don't derail your P&L, of course, but also aren't able to derail your decarbonization plans.
And I'll just jump in here to also say that this chart really illustrates how dynamic the energy markets are. So one thing is I've seen lots of presentations that have like a point estimate of what a particular power purchase agreement or asset is going to do, which doesn't really show the uncertainty of what that could do. And so I'd say my recommendation here is, getting your leadership comfortable with why are we doing this, from an additionality, environmental leadership standpoint. And I'd be nervous to have someone go, we're going to save money every year because based on this chart, there could be some years like where that price was $153, or a few years ago, ERCOT prices, I think in August averaged over $200 per megawatt hour. That, if you are a buyer of clean energy selling into that market, that made your program for the year. However, if you're looking at that 38 right now, all of a sudden, if it's looking like a big spend number. So just understanding that this can happen, this is part of being in an energy market, and is business to be expected is part of the story, not just I know what it's going to be crystal ball, because no one can do that.
Yeah, and I glossed over the word analytics, but I think that's a big part of it. It's not just forecasting, but it's reforecasting as this dynamic market changes in real time. So I think that's a big part of it is not just setting expectations, but managing them on an ongoing basis.
All right, so this is the foreign entity of concern and regulatory risk exposure. So as an environment and sustainability leader, all of a sudden I'm faced with potential national security compliance risk. It's really muddying, like, and scary to think that now all of a sudden my sustainability objectives are at risk of, like, you know, compliance. So I'm not going to go through these line by line, but and that I would highly recommend having a tax counsel for any of these questions. But just flagging that this is something that should be managed and observed and make sure that it's considered. So that if you are doing any clean procurement with and signing any contracts, this is a very important thing to just keep in mind, that this is addressed in those negotiations.
Yeah, and I'd just add and say, in particular, the majority of what's available in the market to corporate buyers right now is solar PV, and a large portion of that supply chain could be or is tied to many countries that would be considered in the FEOC restrictions. So just making sure that your supplier, your counterparty has their ducks in a row is certainly an important thing. probably more so on PV and storage for that matter than wind, which has a very kind of Western domestic supply chain in many cases.
And then, one thing as we go through this, it can get really easy to get caught up in like, what about this? What about this? What if this? And so part of the challenge here is also making sure that it's a digestible number of scenarios that are being analyzed. And, like we showed the uncertainty on the spend or on the revenue in ERCOT, having hundreds of scenarios is probably diminishing marginal returns after you've got a few of the key ones outlined. So one thing to mention is you're going to hear a lot of people saying a lot of different things, and just kind of distilling it down to a few scenarios is going to make it a lot more manageable to think about and reduce the cognitive load that the leaders are facing today.
All right, so maybe a little bit of doom and gloom in the what's keeping us up at night, but have no fear. There are strategies and tactics that we're seeing clients and industry taking to manage the current situation.
All right.
And
So, oh,
I was just saying, and they differ based on who you are in the market. So yeah, Shazad, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no worries. So the biggest question is move fast or pause. And it can be different for different people. And having been at large companies, I can say, one thing about established clean energy programs is what we're hearing, and what makes sense there is a strong drive to accelerate procurement, to take advantage of as many of those tax credits as possible, basically getting while the getting's good, so to speak, and just feasting on any projects that can uh, continue to be at lower costs, because there's a broad expectation that the PPA or power purchase agreement prices will increase after the tax credits expire.
Yeah, but not every organization with targets or commitments has an established clean energy program with armies of individuals with decades of experience. But let's be real, like your core business in a lot of cases is not energy, and your organization might not be equipped the way that some other organizations are. So when we're thinking about, obviously, I think without name dropping, you know who these established clean energy programs are, but most of us probably aren't in that category. So we've broken it down into two other categories, and we're thinking about emerging programs. We're thinking of those who may have already done a deal or have green tariffs in place, have been buying RECs or EACs in different markets around the world. Maybe this program went to market at a time where it was a buyer's market, and that first deal that you did look good and might be making you money. The dynamics have flipped. Like we talked about this in the state of the market. It is a seller's market. The developers are having more influence on pricing or control on pricing and contract terms. So what does a program that's an emerging program do? It's decision time. It essentially is the takeaway here. So, do you double down on the strategy? Do you maybe like normalize from a portfolio level this P&L and say, okay, well, we did really well, and with our first deal, we can kind of offset that with our second deal. Essentially, it's this game of musical chairs right now, and it's are you going to get a seat? So yeah, that means just looking at your strategy and your risk, and not spending months and months in procurement with little to show for it, but probably making a decision to go or no go. And then there are first-time buyers or our new entrants. Welcome to the world of renewable energy. Fun time to be getting in the game. This is Shazad in fantasy football, by the way. So the market can feel daunting. We're talking about some of this doom and gloom, but it's not all doom and gloom. There are real opportunities right now. So, if you have already built internal alignment and you've talked to finance and risk, and your sustainability team is on board, it's not necessarily too late to run a solo RFP and go to market. That said, what we're seeing a lot of companies in this position do is join cohorts. So team up, whether it's with your industry or an organization that may be a frenemy. That there is an opportunity to leverage a shared balance sheet, shared smaller bite of the pie, if you will, and share some of that risk and complexity among multiple buyers going at it together. So we are seeing some success with these cohorts aggregating first-time buyers and really helping fast track education and sharing some of the risks associated with that go-to-market. So yeah, I guess the real question here is less about whether a PPA is right for you and more about whether your organization is ready to move with urgency. This is my takeaway, my mic drop moment on the slide. All right, this is a lot.
Yeah, so we're not going to go through this line by line, also in the interest of time, but just want to highlight a few things, whether that the tactics do differ if you're large or small. We talked about the foreign entity of concern, the supply chain, like if you're looking at scope 3, for example, making sure that those provisions are captured in your contracts. And then also ESG compliance. I think one of the things that's out there with the greenhouse gas protocol revisions is for smaller entities, the reporting requirements in jurisdictions can be smaller or more general, whereas for larger entities that have more consumption, the granularity of the data and the expectations are higher. So just noting that the ESG compliance burden on large buyers is going to be more. So just flagging, those are two things that as companies are doing their procurement to think about is getting your supply chain and your ESG in order is a big issue. Hand over to Sam.
Let's see. I'll handpick a couple of these or cherry pick. Let's talk about scale. So, if you are a large buyer and you've already done utility scale PPAs, you have a seasoned structuring team, you can take 200 or 300 megawatts at a time. There certainly is probably more out there for you. You are, a bell at the ball, if you will, from an off-taker perspective. There could be opportunity here for more complex deals and to interest developers around structuring in storage, thinking about 24/7 carbon-free matching. So that is something from a scale perspective that a large organization might have. Now, if you're a mid-size or small buyer, maybe the VPPA isn't for you right now. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that doesn't mean there aren't other options on the table, and that's what I really want to emphasize here. You can think about where applicable. Can I get into community solar? What can I do on site? Do I have adjacent land? Can I think about PV plus storage and of course, when we're thinking about a MAC curve, there are opportunities for efficiency and demand response as well. But from a renewables perspective, potentially other options on the table. Don't just focus on one lever. Really think about what's best for you and your organization. We've talked about a buyer's market, so I think I need to talk about the contract structuring. Not just price is, it's not just price where the developers have leverage. If you're a big buyer with, a investment grade credit rating and a track record of being a counterparty for PPAs, you may actually still have some leverage. That's you're someone that the developers have already worked with in most cases, and you might be able to rinse and repeat an agreement. You might be able to get a little bit more detailed on change of laws, clauses on indemnities, on availability guarantees. But if you're a smaller buyer, you might want to think about simplicity here. So that's where a cohort can be really helpful. Is aligning on terms, using a vendor provided contract rather than your own form contract, which you may or may not have, and really avoiding what can honestly be a year of negotiating bespoke language. So, the risk profile is different and the contracting approach needs to be different. I would say in both cases, given the timelines that we've talked about, you want to focus on late stage assets. And what does that mean? That means, full interconnection studies have been done. Yeah, there's an EPC lined up, equipment's either on site or purchased and guaranteed, potentially working with a proven developer. I would say, contracting for certainty. So, just kind of kill some of these nice to have provisions in the contract that you might spend valuable time negotiating, but at the end of the day, don't really matter, or don't matter as much as other clauses, which could be things like schedule milestones, substitution rights, make good payments for slippage in timing, because that can impact the project economics given the tax credit scenario. Without reading line for line every single one of these, maybe we leave it there for now, unless there's one more you want to jump into. I'm looking at the clock and we're a little behind schedule.
Yeah, I know. I'll acknowledge that there was a comment about energy as a service, and as Sam mentioned, definitely if the utility scale solar is not the right fit for you, there's a lot of activity on co-locating solar plus storage behind the meter, especially as transmission costs become a bigger part of utility bills. Avoiding those by having on-site resources becomes more and more economic. All right, so quickly, just yeah, in the interest of time, wanted to share a little bit about Verse and what we do. So we're in the space of we're a technology company that's built software to help with the planning and procuring, from having data, evaluating different clean energy strategies, especially against different Scope 2 rules and futures, evaluating offers and helping support anything in that space, to operating, tracking your footprint on your utility bills, understanding market exposures, and then Sam will talk more about this last one, the portfolio insights, which is really tracking and understanding how a power purchase agreement is doing from pre-COD through its lifetime. And over to you, Sam. Dive deeper.
Yeah, so if you have operating contracts, there's a lot to think about, whether it's budgeting for the next month, quarter, year, or how am I performing this month? We do have a software program that is validating the invoices that a developer's analyst is putting together in Excel. So running that through our automated invoice validation platform, finding data generation errors, making sure to flag that before your invoice payment is due, so like you can adjust accordingly. And then also thinking about the forecast. We talked about how dynamic and volatile these markets are, and where robust analytics can help you reset expectations as the world changes. So having a proprietary approach to short-term forecasting, short and midterm forecasting is really important for managing those expectations. And it kind of gets us into like, what is this new gold standard? I think traditionally corporations have either tried to do this in-house, and for better or worse, some organizations will add the appropriate headcount and others won't. Or working with consultants, as a recovering consultant, I can say, of course, legitimate route. But there are certainly new ways of doing things that we'd like to encourage everyone to think about, and that's really relying on software and technology as as a tool for being a force multiplier. So this will help you move from a reactive position. Why did the invoice deviate so much from my expectations, to a proactive position? We see that what's happening in August and in ERCOT is less than what we had forecasted. Therefore, we expect our net spend to be higher than what we'd budgeted. Which helps avoid that scrambling for missing budgets, for missing key communication with stakeholders. So what we think is that this is not necessarily replacing any expertise or anything like that, but it really is augmenting your organization to have this software as a co-pilot, to be able to use analytics to validate decisions and think about you know what we can do moving forward to meet our energy and sustainability goals, and really see advanced organizations codifying this as that standard operating procedure. Uh, Without too much time on the clock, just a quick screenshot of the Verse Aria platform and how the budgeting might look for a solar asset. Yeah, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but fun to give you a little peek behind the curtain of Oz on how things are looking.
And then yeah, again, in the interest of time, just kind of give a high level, one of the things that came out of the one big beautiful bill is continued support for battery storage. And so there are a lot of corporates starting to evaluate battery energy storage solutions. And so here we're just highlighting there was a customer that was asking, how does battery energy storage create value in my portfolio? How would I operate it? And what specific projects create the most value? And so there's a lot of things that we've done there to support, from like quantifying the value, evaluating, and then of course the portfolio insights that Sam's mentioned, in consolidation with the renewable energy portfolio gives a lot of insight into what's going on, so that they can manage that clean program with confidence. And of course, I've lived and breathed this. There's a lot of spreadsheets that can go in. Energy markets have a lot of data, interval data, sitting in lots of spreadsheets. So a lot of the result and value is also just getting everything in one place for one holistic view. And we're very proud of the work we did here. So just want to highlight, if you're thinking about storage, that's another area that we've really been focusing on. And Sam, if you go to the next slide, just kind of some sample analysis of like what are the value components of these different offers, from like the ancillary service markets where they support renewable integration in wholesale markets, to the energy arbitrage of moving from low value hours to high value hours.
And we talked about the different tactics for different organizations. This is front of meter. This is standalone utility scale storage mostly that you're seeing here. Important to note that this similar analysis can be done considering load for a specific site behind the meter, and understanding what kind of IRR you might expect if you were to add certain flexibility, whether it's through storage or cogen or other technologies. Deep breath. I think that might be, yes, the last slide. So we successfully saved some time for questions. I see Jessica coming back on here.
Yes, and I was going to say, before I jump into some of the questions I have, there were a couple that came in through the chat, talking about private sector partnerships. And I do know last year there was that was kind of the big theme. One of the things that we covered at Lean Leader was the public-private partnerships, and even more so now with a lot of federal contracts, and federal money that went to renewable resources in the past. It's not always there. So the involvement of the private partnerships and the private sector, and how have you seen that play out?
Great question. So there's, I would be remiss to not mention data centers in this conversation. Like there is a lot of policy debate, and the system operators are really struggling to figure out, and utilities, quite frankly, how to operate in this world where it's not like gradual load growth of 1-2%, but like I want thousands of megawatts in your grid. And answering the question is, the utilities are, having been in the utility world, like the question, working at PG&E, the investor-owned utility, one of the big questions is, how do you connect these large loads and not harm your other customers? And so that's a really big debate right now. Like capacity market prices are going crazy in PJM. And I know it's easy to point the finger at data centers, but also there hasn't been a lot of build out for a long time. And so now we're seeing kind of the consequences of not building, and short, like long lead times for these new assets. So I would just highlight that, there's a lot of creativity going on around like how do you build microgrids behind the meters. We're seeing obviously the resurgence of nuclear and as a result of this, so co-located nuclear, small modular reactors. So the commercial market is getting creative, but there is an active policy like speed up interconnection, reform these processes. That's also very top of mind right now.
Do you think there was any way to predict that, there would be such a demand in such a short period of time? You mentioned data centers. I live in Maryland, and Northern Virginia is home to like 70% of it. So, I mean, was there a way that the country could have planned better, or was it just something that came about? I mean, I don't want to say so quickly, but it was not in the news, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere.
Well, I asked ChatGPT in 2020, but it didn't. GPT-2 didn't have a good response for me, unfortunately. I didn't even know about ChatGPT in 2020. But yeah, I think it's interesting. The grid was really built around mega assets, like transmitting from one single source to a lot of users. And what we've seen as many, many smaller assets are generating is that the grid wasn't really prepared. And that doesn't answer your question of could we have seen this coming? I think that if you look at past iterations of capacity addition forecasts and load growth, no one really had a good view of load growth. We got into this 20-year cycle of no load growth in not just the US, but again the developed world. So things have happened so quickly. Obviously, I think there are hindsight's 2020, and if you look, you could probably see some signs that at the time weren't as obvious. Um, but I do think that we're doing a lot of catch up. We're playing a lot of catch up and being reactive right now. And to Shazad's point around like the role of the public sector is thinking about how do we protect our comfort with around the clock electricity access that a lot of the world doesn't have, while also realistically from a national perspective, try to win an AI race. So I don't have a good answer for you. Maybe Shazad has a better one.
I didn't expect a full-on answer because it's kind of an impossible question, I feel like,
Right.
that I asked too.
It's fun though to think about.
Well, I also think what made it really interesting is just, quite frankly, the pandemic like gave everyone pause to do anything, right? So all of a sudden, power prices were really low. And we saw like prices go from really low to really high. Obviously, what happened in Europe, like prices went crazy there, energy infrastructure. So I think just yeah, I don't think anyone called this, right? Like, and so from that perspective, no crystal ball, but it was a plausible scenario, and that we've gone down the path of a plausible scenario more than most people would have expected.
A fun exercise would be like, okay, if we wiped out the grid and we were playing Sims like back in the Windows 98 days, how would we rebuild the grid? Unfortunately, we can't do that. So we need to work with what we have, think about where the shortfalls are, from a cost and efficiency optimization perspective. Where does it make sense to invest? And I think a lot of people are pointing to transmission distribution, re reformatting interconnection queues, and kind of a shift from first come first served to first ready first served. Thinking about the costs, how do we socialize those, or do we, are they allocated to the big use clients, the industrials, the data centers, or is it something that, and these are all questions that people are debating on a daily basis at this point, but it's they're real questions that need to be answered, and soon, if we're going to meet incoming demand.
I
No,
also gotta say,
yeah.
energy industries kind of reminded me of fashion too. Like I feel like vintage is coming back. Like we're going back in the loop. A decade ago, I was at Solar City, and we were running around telling everyone how DERs and virtual power plants were the next big thing. And now I'm seeing headlines of it coming back, right? Like virtual power plants relieve transmission constraints and help the utilities. So energy's, yeah, I know it's like football, fantasy football. It's also a little like fashion. So
Eh, and people, people are, as you said earlier, are getting creative. And Sam, with your Sims reference, you should have brought it back to like the Oregon Trail from.
Oh man.
I'd probably, yeah. I mean, I'd play that game if it came. I'm not a big video game person, but that one I would definitely do. And we did have a lot of questions come in about price fatality, and you touched on some of that. But are you reassuring your clients going forward? That this bill is, I don't want to say going to destroy them. I don't want to say that, and who knows what in 4 years, what the next administration is going to be, and things are going to change again. So working in in the industry that you work in and having to deal with, federal legislation, state legislation. I mean, I know I've asked a few questions in here, but how are you reassuring your clients that, it's going to be okay? Let's just take this one step at a time. Let's just look at, the data that we have and how we can best predict, what's going to happen in a month, 2 months, 6 months, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's history, the old proverbial repeats itself, right? So, I mean, going into the Inflation Reduction Act, we were worried about, the sunlighting or the sunlighting of the PTC. We were worried about the existence of tax credits. Inflation Reduction Act gave the industry, frankly, the most visibility, or at least what we thought at the time, into the future that it had ever seen. And going back to the origination of the tax-based incentive system for energy, it has always been re-legislated. It has always been something that was going to expire, that had to be put in front of Congress, that had to be approved, that were implemented. They were implemented in different ways, and so I guess my silver lining here is, it's not the first time. This is a resilient industry. It's a needed industry. We've talked about this demand growth ad nauseum in this webinar, and as Shahzad mentioned, like the fastest construction to power timelines are in renewable energy. So it is the cheapest new build electron in almost all of the global energy systems, either wind or solar today. So, if we're thinking about it just from an economic standpoint, from a need standpoint, yes, it's a bummer that these tax incentives don't have the certainty that they once had. To your point, this could change, with even within the administration. We don't know. Maybe unlikely, but certainly it'll be a topic of discussion in future administrations, and future congressional discussions. So my silver lining here, and I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but to get to the point is we've seen it, we've done it before. The industry survived, it thrived. It is going to do so, in my opinion, into the future, long into the future.
I'll just say quickly, one of my favorite expressions in energy is "don't let a good crisis go to waste." I remember when Hurricane Katrina happened, natural gas prices went crazy, and then all of a sudden California was like, we need to do renewables. And that hurricane got started an entire industry that now we're talking about, that's a global, phenomenon, right? That solar is now the most prevalent and growing resource in the world. Was not anything anyone would have seen, and little Hurricane Katrina had a lot to get that started, right? And we're seeing like energy security in Europe as like, they're leading the way on like getting policies to get a really decarbonized grid. So from that perspective, I think, this one thing that's really exciting for me is like energy is now dinner conversation. When I started my career at PG&E, people were like, "What do you do?" I'm like, "I work at the utility." They're like, "Okay, next question. Like, let's move on." Now, like talking about energy policy, infrastructure, reliability. We're getting more and more great minds into these conversations, and I've never been more optimistic that we're going to find some great solutions in the coming years.
And I love that. I think that's a perfect way to wrap it up. I mean, I'm from a residential perspective, we have solar. And so I always am talking to people about, I'm like, we produce more energy than we use, and we have an EV hookup. So, there's so many benefits. So I am finding, I get a little bit too excited when I talk about it. My husband says, but I'm like, but it's great. I wish we had done this when when we first moved in, because it's been wonderful. Well, I know we are running out of time. We had some great questions come in, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen that will be available in a follow-up email. If you could provide any and all feedback and additional questions for Sam and Shazad, they will get back to you. I know some of the people working behind the scenes on the webinar have already shared your contact information, but if you want them to get in touch with you, obviously feel free to add that information to the survey as well. But thank you for being on with us. And Shazad and Sam, thank you for the work that you put into the presentation. And we're going to conclude today's webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Really appreciate you and E&E Leader having us and being a thought leader in the space.
Yeah, no, we appreciate you being here. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.